Hello everyone and welcome to Capitol Watch for Friday, March 30th, our weekly look at legislative happenings in Jefferson City. And joining us is MSBA's governmental relations consultant, Mike Grote. And Mike, as always, thanks for being with us.
Good to see you this morning.
And Mike, of course, one of the bills we continue to follow is House Bill 1740, the big omnibus bill that we're very concerned about. What, if anything, happened with that this week?
Well, this week it continued to kind of sit its place, but there's a little bit of movement now. This past week, the big thing that happened politically is that filing is closed for candidates looking to run for office in 2012. And I think what we're going to see now that that has taken place gives House leadership a little bit better idea of which candidates might be at risk, which candidates they can definitely secure votes from. And I think they're now going back and beginning to work that vote count again and see where they are on 1740. What we've always been told is that once we got past this filing deadline, which occurred on Tuesday, that we would again see a push. And we saw that this week. We saw a little bit of counting going on by leadership as to where their members were, speaking with each member individually, making sure they had an idea of where they thought those votes were going to be. So we're seeing the beginning stages of a ramping up on that piece of legislation again.
It still has to be approved by the House Rules Committee before it goes to the floor. Do you anticipate some movement on that next week, maybe?
I do, actually. Usually House Rules has two meetings. They either meet on Monday or on Thursday, sometimes both of each week. I expect to see 1740 come out of Rules next week. Simply just wasn't posted up for the calendar this week.
Mm-hmm. The budget is also of great concern, of course, Mike, and of course the House has passed their version of the budget. It's over on the Senate side. What's been happening on the Senate side with the budget?
Sure. A couple of big things have been going on with the budget in getting ready for what they call the markup process. And that's kind of the next step of the Senate will release their version of all the House committee substitute bills again, and they'll start working through those bills and line by line figuring out what they can and can't have based on what budget figures they have. The big issue this week, though, has been what is the actual budget numbers. There's some concern that the House booked in their budget $70 million of tax amnesty dollars, which is a piece of legislation that they had passed and sent over to the Senate. The Senate has not passed that piece of legislation yet, so the Senate is unwilling, some members of the Senate, excuse me, are unwilling to book that $70 million in the budget. There's some other additional one-time funds, and so we kind of have this range of 70 to maybe 150 million. I know that's a big range, that there could be a difference between the House and the Senate budgets. And so that's starting to set the scene for what has to get cut in the Senate version and how they make amends in the conference committee process of such a big split, and how they eventually pass that tax amnesty bill through the Senate, if at all.
So does that put funding for education at risk at all?
It puts funding for everything at risk. And especially, I would argue, education and even some of the social service budget lines, those things that typically don't get cut very deeply. When we're looking at all the things that have already been cut in the budget, the scaling back that it has gone through over the last couple of years, and then to see potentially another 150 million have to be cut again, this could be the worst budget year that we've seen in the history of the state.
Mm-hmm. Another issue that came up this week, Mike, it's come up before in the legislature. There was a hearing on HJR 70, a proposed constitutional amendment that would get rid of what's commonly known as the Blaine Amendment in the Missouri Constitution. Tell us about that.
Sure. It's a familiar hearing that we have a number of years. What you saw happening is Representative Shane Scholler, who is the sponsor of that legislation, essentially came forward and said, I've been told all along that I can't dedicate some of these funds unless we get rid of the Blaine Amendment, so I'm here to get rid of the Blaine Amendment. And you got caught in this conversation with legislators of saying, well, if you're opposing this piece of legislation, you're opposing the will of the people to be able to vote on this issue. And so it actually became a very interesting hearing, I guess, in terms of let's go all the way back to the Constitution of 1870 and how we ended up with this language and what's the historical reason for why it's there. I'm not sure a lot of movement was made on the issue, but it's definitely something that hangs out there. It's definitely something that we're going to see again before this session is over.
And of course, Mike, that's something we would strongly oppose. Getting rid of that prohibition against basically spending public money on private schools is what it amounts to.
Exactly. And so the conversation that then was had is, well, if a private school then does, if we did get rid of it, if a private school takes these funds, does that mean that the school boards then get to control those private schools? And so that was a very interesting conversation, a dynamic that when you have issues like this that get sponsored, that people don't always necessarily think through if A, then B, if B, then we're down at Z at that point in time, and figuring out what those ramifications are.
Another bill that saw some action this week, Mike, was a bill that will allow the State Board of Education to intervene more quickly in unaccredited school districts. Where's that now?
Sure. HB 1174, which was sponsored by Mike Lair on the other end, on the House end of the building, saw committee hearing and an executive session in the Senate this past week in the Senate Education Committee. And we saw a great effort by the chairman of that committee, Senator David Pierce, to make sure this didn't become an omnibus bill, much like we have down the House. He was very strict to his committee members, saying, this is not the path I want to go. At the same time, we had Senator Jane Cunningham, who came to the committee with 4 amendments that she wanted to pass, a couple of which she was able to get onto the piece of legislation, a couple which the committee was definitely opposed to. So I think Senator Pierce did a fabulous job on preventing that from becoming an omnibus bill that was going to potentially attract a lot of interest. But the bill itself, the underlying bill, 1174, something that Missouri School Board Association has supported. We continue to support the underlying bill and think it'll be very beneficial in helping state school boards intervene in some of those unaccredited districts.
Another bill I wanted to ask you about, Mike, deals with due process procedures and special ed hearings. What is that bill about? Sure.
Senate Bill 1595 was third read, left the Senate this week. It's sponsored by Senator Will Kraus. Essentially what that bill is doing is in special ed hearing cases and due process hearings, that it's removed from what we would typically see as being the normal process and is actually being taken over to the Administrative Hearing Commission. So now all those proceedings will go through the Administrative Hearing Commission. The other provision of the bill is that it requires members of the at least 3 members of the Administrative Hearing Commission to receive additional education in special education issues before they're able to rule on any of those cases. So it's definitely a changing in the way in which we handle some of those due process cases.
So looking ahead to next week, Mike, I guess we may see some action on 1740. We may see some movement on the budget, it sounds like.
The budget we're definitely going to see movement on next week. I expect either on Tuesday or Wednesday of next week we will begin the markup process in the Senate Appropriations Committee. And typically that's a 2-day process that they'll work through every single one of the bills, but that'll definitely begin next week. I think they had the hope of trying to deliver the budget to the Senate floor by that 2nd week in April. As a reminder, the deadline for that to get the budget completed through House Committee or through a conference committee is a week prior to the closing of session. So on May 11th, we have to have the budget completely done. So they're trying to speed that timeline up a little bit. I think we'll also see some work on 1740 next week as they figure out where exactly they are, what they can and can't pass. Naturally, tenure continues to be a big discussion of the bill, the tax credits, or continue to be a big conversation in that bill and how we move forward.
All right, Mike Grote, thanks a lot for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we thank you for being with us on this edition of Capitol Watch, and we will continue to keep you informed on legislative activity as we head toward the close of the legislative session in mid-May through our Legislative Voice electronic newsletter we send to you every Friday, and of course the daily blog on the MSBA website. Thanks for being with us, and we hope that you can be with us next week for another edition of MSBA's Capitol Watch.